Flint, Michigan. December 1941. The telegram arrived at Buick's design studio on a Tuesday morning, 6 days after Pearl Harbor changed everything. Harley Earl held it between his fingers like a fragile thing, reading it twice to make sure he understood correctly. The United States Army Ordnance Department was requesting something that made no sense. They wanted a tank destroyer that was fast, not heavily armored, not a fortress, on tracks. Fast. Earl set the telegram on his drafting table next to sketches of the 1942 Roadmaster's chrome grille. Through the studio's tall windows, December light fell across clay models of automobiles that would never be built. Dreams in 3 dimensions, frozen mid-gesture toward a future that no longer existed. The last civilian car had rolled off Buick's line 3 weeks ago. Now there was only the war. They want it faster than a tank, Earl said to the 3 designers gathered around him. With a bigger gun than a tank, and armor lighter than a tank. Bob Lauer, Earl's lead engineer, frowned at the telegram. That's not a tank destroyer, that's a suicide machine. Or, Earl said slowly, it's something no one's thought of before. The contradiction sat in the room like smoke. Every military mind in America, every military mind in the world, believed the same gospel. Armor saves lives. Thicker plates, better angles, more steel between the crew and the shell. France had built the Maginot Line on this logic. Britain's Matilda tanks wore armor, so thick they barely moved. Even Germany's newest Tigers were essentially pillboxes with engines. But this telegram suggested something else entirely, something that felt wrong at the visceral level where survival instincts live. The order came from Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Bruce, a name Earl didn't recognize. Bruce commanded something called the Tank Destroyer Force, a branch so new it barely existed outside memorandums and War Department conferences. Bruce's philosophy, outlined in the attached technical specifications, read like heresy. A cruiser, not a battleship. Speed is the primary defensive characteristic. Earl had spent 20 years designing automobiles for people who wanted to feel powerful, elegant, untouchable. He understood the psychology of armor, the deep human need to wrap oneself in steel. This Colonel Bruce was asking him to abandon that instinct entirely. What's the target? Lauer asked, scanning the specifications. What are they expecting this thing to kill? Panthers, Tigers, whatever the Germans throw at them. Earl tapped the telegram. Bruce believes massed enemy armor will punch through American lines. His destroyers are supposed to race to the breakthrough point and ambush the Panzers before they can exploit the gap. Race with what? Another designer asked. These specifications call for 55 miles per hour. That's faster than a Roadmaster. Exactly. The room fell silent. Outside, Flint was transforming. The arsenal of democracy was learning to speak in different languages. The vocabulary of propellers and turrets, a tolerance is measured not in comfort, but in lethality. Buick's assembly lines, which once built luxury sedans for doctors and lawyers, were being reconfigured for something Earl couldn't quite visualize yet. He walked to the window, watching December wind push leaves across the empty parking lot. Somewhere in Texas, at a place called Fort Hood, Colonel Bruce was training battalions of men in a doctrine that didn't yet have machines to match it. Bruce's vision, highly mobile formations that could move faster than German tanks, strike from unexpected angles, and vanish before return fire arrived, or it was everything a tank wasn't supposed to be. The Germans will call them tin cans, Lauer said behind him. One direct hit and the crew is gone. Then we design it so it doesn't get hit. Earl turned from the window. What's the fastest thing on tracks we've ever considered? The T-42 prototype, Christie's suspension, aircraft engine. But that was theoretical, not anymore. Earl moved to the drafting table, pulling a fresh sheet of paper. Bruce isn't asking for a tank. He's asking for a weapon system built around speed. Everything else, armor, weight, crew comfort, is secondary to velocity. His pencil moved across the paper, finding the shape of something that didn't exist yet. Not a tank, not exactly a car. Something between a predator's geometry, low and aggressive. The designers gathered closer, watching Earl's hand translate military specifications into physical form. Torsion bar suspension, Earl said, sketching the undercarriage. We've been developing it for our luxury line. Smooth ride at high speeds better than Christie. We're asking crews to drive 55 miles per hour cross country. They need stability. And the armor? Lauer asked. 1 inch maximum. We keep the weight at 20 tons total. Earl drew the turret, open-topped, minimal. Everything about this machine prioritizes mobility. The armor isn't meant to stop shells. It's meant to stop small arms fire while the Hellcat is moving too fast to be targeted. You're already calling it Hellcat? Earl smiled slightly. Bruce's motto is seek, strike, destroy. We'll need a name that matches the spirit. His pencil moved again, sketching a wildcat, biting down on tank treads. This is what we'll paint on the hull. Predator symbolism, speed and aggression. The design took shape across the afternoon. Earl's team worked with the peculiar intensity of men who understood they were drawing something that would kill and be killed, that would carry 5 human beings at 60 miles per hour toward machines designed to destroy them. There was no room for the elegant curves of automotive design, the chrome flourishes and aesthetic gestures. Every line served lethality. By evening, they had preliminary sketches. A low-profile hull, barely 8 feet tall. An open turret mounting a 76-millimeter gun, the same weapon being developed for the new Sherman tanks, but on a platform half the weight. A Wright R975 radial engine, 9 cylinders of aircraft-grade power, mounted at the rear for easy field maintenance, and Buick's new torsion bar suspension, each wheel independently sprung for stability at speeds no tracked vehicle had ever attempted. It's beautiful, Lauer said quietly, and Earl knew exactly what he meant. The Hellcat possessed the terrible beauty of pure function, every component optimized for a single purpose, nothing wasted, nothing decorative. It was the opposite of everything Earl had spent his career creating, and yet it followed the same fundamental principle, form expressing intention. Bruce is gambling everything on an idea, Earl said, studying the drawings. He's betting that German tanks are too slow to catch this thing, too heavy to maneuver against it, and too tactically rigid to adapt when it hits from an unexpected angle. And if he's wrong, Earl didn't answer immediately. Through the studio windows, Flint's streetlights were coming on, illuminating a city at war. In homes across America, families were gathering around radios, listening to news from fronts that were all bad. The Philippines falling, Wake Island surrounded, Singapore under siege. Everywhere armor was winning, the Germans in Russia, the Japanese in Asia. Steel against flesh, and steel was winning. If Bruce is wrong, Earl finally said, we'll have built the fastest coffins in military history. He picked up the telegram again, reading Colonel Bruce's final paragraph. The tank destroyer must be capable of moving to threatened sectors faster than enemy armor can exploit breakthroughs. Speed is not merely desirable. It is the foundational principle upon which all other design decisions rest. And that foundational principle. Bruce wasn't asking for a modification of existing doctrine. He was proposing a complete inversion of everything armor warfare had learned in 2 years of European combat. While the Germans added weight and thickness to their Panzers, while the British built infantry tanks so heavy they could barely move, Bruce wanted to strip away protection and gamble everything on velocity. It was radical. It was terrifying. And sitting in that design studio in December 1941, with winter darkness falling over Michigan, Harley Earl decided it was exactly right. We'll need wind tunnel testing, he said, his voice taking on the crisp certainty of commitment. I want to know how air flows over this hull at 60 miles per hour, and we'll need to solve the weight equation. Every pound of armor we add costs us speed. The crews will be exposed, Lauer warned. Open turret means no overhead protection. Then we make them fast enough that exposure doesn't matter, Earl gathered the sketches. Bruce's doctrine assumes the enemy will never see the Hellcat until it's too late. Ambush tactics, hit and run. The crews survive by not being where the enemy expects them. It was a philosophy built on speed, surprise, and the absolute conviction that mobility could substitute for armor. In the warm safety of the design studio, it seemed plausible, almost elegant in its way, a solution that rejected conventional wisdom and proposed something entirely new. Whether it would work in combat with real steel and real blood was a question that would be answered in fog and fire on a morning 2 years distant in a French town called Arracourt. But on that December evening in Flint, Michigan, Harley Earl and his team committed to the gamble. They would build Colonel Bruce's cruiser. They would create a machine that abandoned the fundamental logic of armored warfare and replaced it with something more dangerous: faith in speed. The drawings went to engineering the next morning. General Motors, Milford Proving Ground, Michigan, April 1943. The T-70 prototype sat in the dawn light like a question mark made of steel. Lieutenant Edwin Leiper walked a slow circle around it, his boots crunching on the test track's gravel. 16 months had passed since Harley Earl's team committed the design to paper. 16 months of engineering problems, manufacturing delays, and endless debates about whether the whole concept was fundamentally flawed. Now, finally, there was metal. "She doesn't look like much," said Sergeant Henry Hartman, standing beside the machine with his arms crossed. Hartman had transferred to the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion from the Armored Cavalry, where he'd spent 2 years maintaining M3 half-tracks, crude gun platforms that barely qualified as fighting vehicles. The T-70 represented something entirely different. "She's not supposed to look like much," Leiper replied. "She's supposed to move." The prototype measured just over 17 feet long, turret included, and stood barely 8 feet tall. Compared to the M4 Sherman tanks on the adjacent testing ground, the T-70 appeared almost fragile, a greyhound among bulldogs. Its hull was a study in minimalism, sloped armor plates welded at aggressive angles, an open-top turret that left the crew exposed to everything above chest level, and a profile so low it seemed to hug the earth. Robert Lauer approached from the engineering tent, carrying a clipboard thick with test protocols. His role had evolved from Earl's lead designer to field engineer, translating automotive theory into combat reality. The transition hadn't been smooth. "Torsion bar suspension tested at full load," Lauer announced, checking items off his list. "She rides level at 40 miles per hour over the rough section, better than we predicted." "And the speed trials?" Lauer's expression complicated. "That's what we're here to find out." The Milford Proving Ground had been built for testing passenger cars, elegant machines designed for comfort and style. Its banked oval track was engineered for roadmasters and Electras, vehicles whose performance parameters involved smooth acceleration and quiet rides. The engineers had never imagined it would host a 17-ton weapons platform attempting speeds that would terrify most civilian drivers. Captain Thomas Evans, commanding officer of the 704th Company C, arrived with the test crew. 5 men total: commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver. They'd spent the previous week learning the T-70's systems, familiarizing themselves with controls that felt more like a sports car than a military vehicle. "What's the run profile?" Evans asked. 3 laps at increasing speed," Lauer explained. "First lap at 35 miles per hour, second at 45, final lap at maximum velocity. We're monitoring suspension stress, engine temperature, track tension, and crew station stability." "Crew station stability," Hartman muttered. "That's a nice way of saying, will the gunner get bounced out of the turret?" It wasn't a joke. The open turret design, Earl's concession to weight reduction, meant that at high speeds the crew would be fully exposed to wind resistance and centrifugal forces. Standard doctrine for armored vehicles involved buttoned-up crews sealed inside steel shells. The T-70 rejected that safety in exchange for visibility and weight savings. Leiper climbed onto the hull, pulling himself up to the turret ring. From this vantage point, he could see the entire proving ground. Miles of test track stretching across Michigan farmland, converted from automotive testing to weapons evaluation. Other prototypes dotted the facility. Experimental half-tracks, modified Shermans, towed anti-tank guns on new carriages. The whole American war machine was being reinvented here, one test run at a time. "Mount up," Evans ordered. The crew climbed aboard with practiced efficiency. Driver and assistant driver dropped through the front hatches into their stations, where they'd operate in a cramped compartment dominated by the transmission housing. The gunner, loader, and commander positioned themselves in the turret, standing on the basket floor with their torsos exposed above the armored ring. The Wright R975 radial engine coughed once, then roared to life. 9 cylinders of aircraft power, the same engine that drove the M4 Sherman, but In the T-70, it had 30% less weight to push. The mathematical advantage was obvious. The practical reality remained unproven. First lap, 35 miles per hour, Lauer called through a megaphone. On your mark. The T-70 lurched forward, tracks biting into the asphalt of the oval. Even at modest speed, the difference was apparent. Where a Sherman would lumber and pitch, the T-70 glided. Buick's torsion bar suspension absorbing irregularities with automotive smoothness. The crew stood steady in the turret, no violent jolting or unpredictable movements. Leiper watched through binoculars as the prototype rounded the first turn. The low profile and wide track base kept it stable through the banking, none of the top-heavy swaying that plagued taller vehicles. Speed and engineering were proving Earl's fundamental calculation. If you stripped away enough weight and designed the suspension properly, a tracked vehicle could handle like something that belonged on a racetrack. 37 miles per hour on the straight, an engineer called out, reading from a stopwatch. Stable through the curves. The T-70 completed the first lap and continued without slowing. Now the driver pushed the throttle further, asking more from the engine. The pitch of the radial deepened, becoming an aggressive snarl. 40 miles per hour, 45. The prototype accelerated with an eagerness no one had seen in an armored vehicle before. She handles, Hartman said, lowering his binoculars. Actually handles. It was the automotive suspension, the technology Buick had been developing for luxury cars, now repurposed for war. Each wheel moved independently on its torsion bar, maintaining contact with the ground while absorbing shocks that would have thrown a tank with conventional leaf springs. The engineering was elegant and completely unprecedented in tracked vehicle design. The second lap passed in a blur of speed and noise. The crew remained stable in the open turret, though wind tore at their uniforms and forced them to squint against the airstream. At 45 miles per hour, the T-70 moved faster than most German tanks could achieve on flat roads with perfect conditions, and they were just getting started. Final lap, Lauer announced, maximum speed. This was the gamble. The specifications called for 55 miles per hour, a velocity that seemed impossible for anything on tracks. Earl's team had engineered every component for this moment. The suspension, the transmission, the track design, the whole aerodynamics. But engineering and reality didn't always agree. The T-70's engine note climbed into a scream. 50 miles per hour on the straight, 52, 55. The prototype rocketed down the oval's backstretch, moving faster than highway traffic, tracks throwing up a rooster tail of dust and displaced air. The crew in the turret leaned into the wind, holding positions that would have been impossible in any other combat vehicle. 57 miles per hour. Jesus Christ, someone whispered. The T-70 hit the bank turn at a speed that should have been catastrophic. The torsion bars compressed, the wide track base held, and the low center of gravity kept the machine glued to the asphalt. It carved through the curve with precision that belonged to sports cars, not weapons of war. The gunner traversed the turret smoothly, demonstrating that even at this velocity, he could acquire and track targets. 58 miles per hour on the final straight. When the T-70 finally decelerated and rolled to a stop in front of the engineering tent, its engine ticking as it cooled, everyone present understood they'd witnessed something unprecedented. This wasn't a tank. It wasn't even a tank destroyer in the conventional sense. It was something entirely new. A weapons platform that prioritized mobility with such absoluteness that it redefined what armored warfare could be. Captain Evans climbed out of the turret, his face flushed with adrenaline and windburn. "That," he said simply, "will kill Panthers." But Lauer was already moving to the next test station where a different kind of validation waited. Speed was proven. Now they needed to test the price. The firing range occupied the Proving Ground's eastern section where earthen berms and steel plates simulated combat conditions. A captured German Panzer IV turret sat mounted on a test stand, its frontal armor representing the kind of protection American forces would face in Europe. Beside it, a mock-up of a Tiger's frontal plate, 4 inches of face-hardened steel sloped at optimal angles. The T-70 rolled into position at various ranges. 2,000 yards, 1,000 yards, 500 yards. The 76mm gun mounted in its minimal turret looked almost inadequate compared to the massive German armor targets. Standard M62 armor-piercing round, the gunnery officer announced. Engaging Panzer IV frontal armor at 1,000 yards. The gun fired, the report cracking across the range. Through binoculars, Leiper watched the tracer impact the German plate. The shell punched through, leaving a clean penetration hole. Against the Panzer IV's frontal armor, the T-70's gun was adequate. Tiger fur frontal plate, 1,000 yards. The second shot struck the heavier armor and ricocheted, screaming off into the sky. No penetration, not even close. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. The Tiger I and its successor, the Tiger II, represented Germany's answer to Allied armor. 4 and 6 inches of frontal plate, respectively, sloped and hardened to defeat anything the Allies could field. Against those monsters, the T-70's gun was essentially ineffective at combat ranges. Flanking shot, Evans said quietly. Side armor, 500 yards. They repositioned, targeting the Tiger mock-up's flank. The gun fired again, and this time the shell penetrated easily, tearing through the thinner side protection that even German engineers couldn't make impervious without creating an immobile fortress. That's the doctrine, Leiper said, understanding, crystallizing. We're not supposed to face them head on. Bruce's whole tactical philosophy assumes we ambush from the flanks, hit the vulnerable sides, and rear. Which means, Hartman added slowly, the speed isn't just for getting to the fight, it's for surviving the fight. We have to be fast enough to get into flanking positions before they can rotate their guns. The engineering made sense now, brutal, pragmatic sense. The T-70 couldn't win a frontal engagement against Germany's heavy armor. It wasn't designed to. Instead, every ton of armor stripped away, every mile per hour of speed gained, was buying the crew the ability to dictate engagement geometry. The Hellcat's survival depended on never being where the enemy expected, on moving faster than German doctrine could respond. It was a philosophy that demanded near-perfect execution. A single mistake, a wrong turn, a moment's hesitation, a mechanical failure, and the crew would face frontal armor with a gun that couldn't penetrate it, protected by armor that couldn't save them. Showed him the penetration test, Lauer said to his assistant. A new set of plates was wheeled out, samples of the T-70's own armor, ranging from the 1-inch hull sides to the half-inch turret facing. The same 76-millimeter gun firing standard German armor-piercing rounds was positioned at various ranges. The results were devastating. At 1,000 yards, German guns could punch through every part of the T-70's protection. At 500 yards, even the 75-millimeter guns on Panzer IVs could penetrate reliably. The Hellcat wasn't armored against anything except small arms fire and shell fragments. One direct hit, Evans said flatly, and we're done. That's the trade, Lauer replied. Colonel Bruce's entire doctrine depends on not getting hit. The speed buys you the ability to control engagement range and angle. The minimal armor buys you the speed. It's a closed loop. You can't have one without sacrificing the other. They stood in silence, watching engineers measure the penetration holes, quantifying exactly how vulnerable the T-70's crew would be in combat. This was the price of speed, written in millimeters of steel that weren't there, in protection that had been deliberately omitted to save weight. Leiper thought about the crews who would take these machines to war. 5 men in an open turret racing across battlefields at 60 miles per hour, gambling their lives on the assumption that speed could substitute for armor. It required a particular kind of courage, not the stoic endurance of infantry or the calculated risk-taking of bomber crews, but something more aggressive, faith in velocity as a defensive weapon. We need more gun, Hartman said. If we can't penetrate their frontal armor, we need ammunition that can. HVAP rounds, Lauer replied. High-velocity armor piercing, they're in development. Tungsten cord penetrators that should punch through Tiger frontal plate at reasonable ranges, but they won't be available in quantity for at least a year. So until then, we flank or we die. Essentially, yes. The sun was setting over the Milford Proving Ground, casting long shadows across the test ranges. The T-70 prototype sat cooling on the firing line, its open turret like an exposed wound in the gathering darkness. Around it, engineers collected data, measured stresses, calculated the precise tolerances between function and failure. In 6 weeks, the T-70 would be standardized as the M18 Gun Motor Carriage and enter full production. Buick's lines in Flint would begin producing them in Nora quantity, with a goal of 8,186 units to equip Bruce's growing tank destroyer force. The first production vehicles would go to the 704th, whose crews had spent months testing and refining the design. But standing there in the twilight, watching engineers pack up their instruments and test crews clean their weapons, Leiper understood that all the engineering excellence, all the speed and innovation came down to a simple equation. The Hellcat was the fastest way to kill Panthers, and also the fastest way to die trying. The machine was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure, a distillation of American engineering optimism and battlefield pragmatism. It represented a bet that mobility could trump armor, that speed could substitute for steel, that 5 men in a tin can moving at 60 miles per hour could outthink and outmaneuver German heavy tanks. Whether that bet would pay off wouldn't be determined here, on the smooth asphalt of a Michigan testing ground. It would be decided in Europe, in fog and mud and fire, when the Hellcat finally met the Panthers. It was designed to kill. Anzio, Italy, May 1944. The M18 Hellcat sat in a crater that had been a street corner 3 days earlier. Lieutenant Edwin Leiper crouched beside its track watching German artillery walk across the beachhead in methodical increments. The shells were searching, probing for American positions in the rubble of what used to be a fishing village on Italy's western coast. This wasn't the war Colonel Bruce had envisioned. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion had arrived at Anzio in late April, their brand-new Hellcats still wearing factory paint under hastily applied camouflage. The crews had trained for months on Bruce's doctrine, rapid deployment to threatened sectors, massed ambush tactics against breakthrough armor, exploitation of superior mobility. They'd practiced high-speed flanking maneuvers on the open proving grounds of Texas and Michigan. Anzio offered none of those conditions. Movement 2 o'clock, Sergeant Hartman called from the turret. Infantry, looks like a probe. Leiper pulled himself up to the turret ring, binoculars pressed to his eyes. Through the smoke and dust, he could see German soldiers moving between the shattered buildings. A squad, maybe 10 men, advancing cautiously through the rubble toward the American line. Gunner, he round, Leiper ordered. Target the building corner, 20 degrees right. This was the 5th fire mission that morning. The Hellcat's 76mm gun, designed to punch through Panther armor at flanking angles, was being used as field artillery. High explosive rounds against infantry positions, bunkers, machine gun nests, anything except enemy tanks, because there were no enemy tanks. The Germans had learned after 3 months of brutal attrition at Anzio that sending armor into this meat grinder was suicide. The beachhead was 6 miles deep and 15 miles wide, a compressed killing zone where American artillery and naval guns could reach every square meter. German commanders sent infantry, mortars, and artillery, not Panzers. The gun fired, the breech slamming back with mechanical violence. The high explosive shell impacted the building corner in a flash of brick dust and shrapnel. The German infantry scattered, seeking cover in ruins that offered no real protection. Reload, same target, Leiper said mechanically. Captain Evans appeared from the command post, moving in the peculiar combat crouch that everyone at Anzio had learned. Head down, body low, never presenting a silhouette. He slid into the crater beside the Hellcat, breathing hard. Hire wants us to move up, Evans said without preamble. Support the 3rd Infantry's attack on the factory district, direct fire on fortified positions. Leiper felt something cold settle in his stomach. Sir, the Hellcat isn't designed for urban assault. We're supposed to be tank destroyers, not infantry support. I'm aware of what we're supposed to be, Lieutenant. Evans's voice was flat, exhausted. But right now, we're the only self-propelled guns the infantry have that can keep up with their advance. The M10s are too slow, and the Shermans are needed elsewhere. This was the pattern that had emerged over 6 weeks of Anzio combat. The Hellcats, the fastest armored vehicles on the beachhead, were being dispersed in penny packets to support infantry attacks. 1 platoon here, 2 vehicles there. Never the massed battalion formations that Bruce's doctrine required. The speed that should have been their tactical advantage had become the reason they were everywhere, except where they belonged. What about the doctrine? Hartman asked from the turret. The whole point of tank destroyer battalions is to stay concentrated, respond to armor threats. The doctrine, Evans interrupted, assumes there's armor to destroy. The truth of it hung in the air. They'd brought the perfect weapon to kill Panthers in open terrain and found themselves instead in close urban combat where their speed was useless and their thin armor was a death sentence. The open turret, brilliant for visibility during high-speed maneuvers, meant that German snipers and mortar fragments could kill the crew with ease. The minimal armor, adequate when you were moving at 50 miles per hour, became suicidal when you had to advance slowly through rubble-choked streets. At 1400 hours, the Hellcat moved forward. The factory district occupied Ancio's northern sector, where German forces had converted industrial buildings into fortified strongpoints. The American attack would have to dig them out room by room, building by building, exactly the kind of grinding attrition warfare the Hellcat was never meant to fight. Leiper guided the vehicle through the ruins, the driver navigating debris that would have stopped a less agile vehicle. The torsion bar suspension, designed for high-speed cross-country movement, now proved valuable in different ways, allowing the Hellcat to climb over rubble and maintain stability on uneven ground. But this wasn't innovation, it was improvisation. Target, the gunner called. Machine gun nest, factory wall, 12 o'clock. Through his periscope, Leiper could see the German position, sandbags and concrete, a heavy machine gun commanding the approach to the factory's main entrance. Standard defensive work, the kind that should be reduced by infantry or artillery. Instead, they were using a tank destroyer. AP round, Leiper ordered, then caught himself. No, wait. We're not punching through armor, we're demolishing a bunker. The distinction felt important, a small rebellion against the misuse of their weapon. The armor-piercing round represented what they were supposed to be doing. The high-explosive shell represented what the war had made them. The gun fired, the bunker disappeared in a blast of concrete dust and spalling debris. The machine gun fell silent. Advance 50 meters, Evans radioed from the command vehicle behind them. Next target is the factory's eastern wall. Intelligence reports a German anti-tank gun position. Now they were hunting guns that were supposed to hunt them. The irony wasn't lost on Leiper. The Hellcat crept forward, every meter feeling wrong. Too slow, too exposed, too vulnerable. The speed that defined the vehicle was being negated by urban terrain that demanded caution. A German Panzerfaust team appeared in a second-story window. The rocket-propelled grenade was the Wehrmacht's answer to American armor, a one-shot disposable weapon that could penetrate any tank from close range. Against the Hellcat's 1-inch armor, he was absolute. Gunner, building front, second floor. The Panzerfaust fired first. The rocket streaked across 30 meters of space in the time it took Leiper to shout a warning. It struck the Hellcat's glacis plate at the junction point between the hull and track assembly, and ricocheted. The warhead, designed to penetrate at 90-degree angles, hit the Hellcat's steeply sloped armor at an oblique angle and skipped off like a stone on water, detonating harmlessly against a wall 20 meters beyond. Leiper felt the impact through the hull, a hollow boom that could have been death but was instead just mathematics, angled, defeating-shaped charge. "Return fire," he ordered, his voice steadier than he felt. The 76mm gun put 3 high-explosive rounds into the building's second story. The Panzerfaust team didn't get a second shot, but the engagement crystallized something Leiper had been feeling since Anzio began. The Hellcat's armor wasn't designed to save them. It was designed to be absent, to be weight they didn't carry. Yet here, in this grinding urban combat, that absence became presence through sheer geometric luck. The slopes that Earl's designers had drawn to save weight were now deflecting rockets that should have killed them. The vehicle wasn't working as intended, but it was working. By evening, the factory district was secured. The 3rd Infantry had advanced 800 meters at a cost that Leiper didn't want to calculate. The Hellcat had fired 47 rounds, 45 high explosive, 2 armor piercing. 0 enemy tanks engaged. Evans called the platoon leaders together in a basement. that had been a wine cellar before the war. Maps covered the walls, marking the slow progress of the beachhead's expansion. Red lines showed German positions, blue lines showed American advances. Nowhere on these maps was there space for the kind of sweeping maneuver warfare Bruce's doctrine required. "Division's pleased with our performance," Evans said, and Leiper heard the complicated bitterness in his voice. "We're being cited for effective infantry support." "We're tank destroyers," Hartman said, "not assault guns." "We're whatever the situation requires us to be." Evans tapped the map. "Tomorrow we're supporting an attack on the railroad embankment. After that, possibly anti-sniper operations in the warehouse district. The M18 has proven versatile in urban combat." Versatile. The word felt like defeat. They'd brought a precision instrument to Anzio, a weapon optimized for a specific tactical role, and combat was turning them into improvised artillery. The speed didn't matter when you measured advances in meters. The minimal armor didn't matter when you were taking fire from all directions anyway. The gun designed to kill Panthers was killing bunkers instead. "What about when we leave Anzio?" Leiper asked. "When we get to France and face actual German armor? We're learning all the wrong lessons here." Evans studied the map in silence. Outside, the nightly artillery exchange was beginning, German guns on the high ground lobbing shells into the beachhead, American and British naval guns responding in thunder that shook dust from the ceiling. "Bruce's doctrine assumes we'll face massed armor attacks," Evans finally said. "That we'll have room to maneuver, space to exploit our speed, but what if that's not how the Germans fight anymore? What if they learned from Russia, from Africa, that concentrating armor just makes it vulnerable to our air power and artillery?" "Then we built the wrong weapon," Hartman said quietly. "Or," Evans replied, "we've built a weapon that's more adaptable than its doctrine." The next morning, a supply truck arrived with ammunition, 20 crates of high-explosive rounds, 2 crates of armor-piercing. The ratio said everything about what the war expected from them. Leiper watched his crew load the shells, stacking them in the Hellcat's limited ammunition storage. Each HE round represented a mission they weren't supposed to perform. Each AP round represented the mission they were designed for, gathering dust, but there was something else happening, something he couldn't quite articulate yet. The crews were learning to use the Hellcat in ways Buick's engineers never imagined. The speed that couldn't be exploited in urban combat translated into rapid repositioning between fire missions. The open turret that exposed them to snipers also gave them situational awareness no buttoned-up crew could match. The thin armor that should have been a fatal flaw was just light enough to let them navigate terrain that stopped heavier vehicles. The M18 wasn't fulfilling Bruce's doctrine, but it was proving something potentially more important, that a well-designed weapon system could transcend the limitations of the doctrine that created it. At Anzio, surrounded by rubble and death, fighting a different war than the one they trained for, the Hellcat crews were discovering that survival came not from following doctrine perfectly, but from adapting faster than the enemy could respond. The speed wasn't just in the engine. It was in the crew's ability to improvise, to learn, to transform a tank destroyer in whatever the moment demanded. 3 weeks later, when the 705th finally rotated off the Anzio beachhead, they'd fired 1,147 rounds of 76mm ammunition. 11 were armor-piercing rounds fired at German self-propelled guns. The rest were high-explosive shells fired at targets Colonel Bruce had never considered. They'd destroyed no Panthers, no Tigers, no massed armor formations, but they'd learned something more valuable. The Hellcat worked even when the war refused to follow the script. As the transport ships carried them back to Naples for rest and refitting, Leiper stood on deck watching the Italian coast recede. Somewhere in France, the invasion was being planned, somewhere beyond Normandy's beaches in the hedgerows and forests of Europe. German Panzers were waiting. The Hellcat would get its chance. The real test was still coming. Arracourt, France, September the 19th, 1944. The fog came in before dawn, rolling across the Lorraine countryside like a living thing. Lieutenant Edwin Leiper watched it thicken from his position on the Hellcat's turret ring, reducing visibility to 30 feet, then 20, then barely the length of the vehicle itself. Weather that should have grounded all operations, that should have kept both sides blind and cautious. Instead, it was perfect. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion had arrived in France 2 months earlier, landing at Normandy and fighting through the bocage hedgerows where the Hellcat's speed was again frustrated by terrain. But 3 days ago, Patton's Third Army had broken into Lorraine, open country, rolling farmland, exactly the landscape Colonel Bruce had envisioned when he wrote his doctrine 4 years earlier. And yesterday, German 5th Panzer Army had launched a counteroffensive to reclaim it. Company C, this is actual, Captain Evans' voice crackled over the radio. Intelligence confirms enemy armor, moving on our position. Unknown strength, but aerial reconnaissance yesterday identified Panthers. Deploy to ambush positions per doctrine. Hold fire until we have target identification. Leiper felt something shift in his chest. Not quite excitement, not quite fear. After months of improvised missions, of using the Hellcat for everything except its intended purpose, they were finally facing the scenario Bruce had designed them for. Massed enemy armor attempting to break through American lines, open terrain that favored mobility, and fog that would negate German gunnery advantages while rewarding aggressive close-range tactics. Driver, advance to the Arracourt road junction, Leiper ordered. Slow and quiet, we're hunting in the fog. The Hellcat moved forward, its Continental engine throttled back to a low murmur. The torsion bar suspension absorbed the uneven ground without protest, the vehicle gliding through the gray morning like a predator. Sergeant Hartman stood in the gunner's position, his eyes straining to penetrate the fog, one hand on the turret traverse control. They'd rehearsed this. Bruce's doctrine emphasized that tank destroyers should never chase enemy armor, never pursue into the unknown. Instead, they positioned themselves where the enemy would come, chose ground that favored the defender, and waited with the patience of ambush predators. The speed wasn't for running toward the fight, it was for getting to the perfect position before the enemy arrived. The road junction emerged from the fog, a crossroads where the Arracourt road met a farm track, creating a natural choke point. Leiper positioned the Hellcat in a shallow depression 20 meters off the road, hull down, only the turret and gun visible above the rise. From here they could cover the approaches while presenting minimal profile. Gunner, load AP, Leiper said quietly. We're finally using the right ammunition. 3 other Hellcats from Company C's 1st Platoon took positions along the road, spacing themselves to create overlapping fields of fire. The deployment followed Bruce's tactical principles exactly, distributed but mutually supporting positions, each vehicle able to engage the same target from different angles, never concentrated enough that one German shell could compromise the whole force. The fog pressed closer, visibility shrank to 15 feet, and somewhere in that gray blindness, German Panthers were advancing. At 7:42 hours, Leiper saw the gun barrel. It emerged from the fog like something from a nightmare. The long 75mm UK-42 gun that made the Panther the most feared tank on the Western Front. The barrel was elevated slightly, searching for targets at medium range, not expecting contact this close. Behind it, the Panther's glacis plate appeared, angled at 55 degrees, thick enough to defeat any American tank gun from the front. But the Hellcat wasn't looking at the front. Target Panther left flank, Leiper said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. Range 30 feet, fire when ready. Hartman had already traversed the turret, the electric motor whirring quietly. Panther's crew had no idea they were being observed. The fog had hidden the Hellcat perfectly, and the German tank's optics were designed for longer range engagement. At 30 feet, the Panther was blind. The 76mm gun fired. The armor-piercing round crossed the space too fast for the eye to follow. It struck the Panther's side armor, only 40mm thick, a quarter of the frontal protection, and punched through like paper. The interior of the German tank became an inferno as hydraulic fluid ignited and ammunition cooked off. Target destroyed, Hartman reported, reloading. But there was no time to celebrate. The Panther's explosion had backlit the fog, and now Leiper could see what was coming, an entire company of German armor, at least 10 vehicles advancing in a loose formation designed for breakthrough operations. The Germans had expected to encounter American positions at the defensive line a mile ahead. Instead, they'd driven straight into an ambush. All guns, open fire, Evans ordered over the battalion net. Engage at will. The fog erupted with muzzle flashes. 4 Hellcats firing in sequence, each shot carefully aimed at the vulnerable flanks and rear of German tanks that couldn't see their attackers. The Panthers, magnificent in frontal armor and main gun performance, were helpless in the fog, blind, confused, unable to maneuver effectively in the close terrain. A second Panther died, then a third. The German formation tried to pivot, turrets traversing desperately to locate the American guns, but the Hellcats were already moving. The speed that had been useless at Anzio, frustrated in the bocage, now became absolute advantage. Each vehicle fired, displaced 20 meters, fired again. The Panthers, 45 tons each, couldn't respond fast enough. Leiper's Hellcat fired 4 times in 90 seconds, hitting 3 different Panthers. The 4th shot missed as the target tried to reverse, tracks churning mud as the German crew realized they were being slaughtered. "Panther, 10 o'clock, he's seen us," the loader called out. The German tank was traversing its turret toward their position, the long gun barrels swinging with mechanical precision. In a frontal engagement, the Panther's 75mm could penetrate the Hellcat's armor from 2,000 meters. At this range, it would go through both sides of the vehicle and keep traveling. "Driver, reverse now," Leiper snapped. The Hellcat shot backward, the driver throwing it into reverse with practiced speed. The Continental engine screamed, tracks bit, and the vehicle was moving before the Panther could fire. 30 miles per hour in reverse, faster than most tanks could manage going forward. The German shot passed through the space where they'd been, missing by meters. "Traverse right, target his flank," Leiper ordered. Hartmann was already moving the gun. As the Hellcat cleared the depression, the angle changed, exposing the Panther's side armor. The deadliest geometry that Earl's designers had drawn in December 1941, the speed that allowed rapid position changes, the gun that could penetrate flanking armor, was proving itself in blood and fire. The shot took the Panther below the turret ring. The German tank shuddered, smoke pouring from its hatches. By 800 hours, the fog was starting to lift. What it revealed was carnage: 15 German tanks destroyed or disabled, their crews killed or fleeing into the countryside. The 704th had lost 1 Hellcat, caught by a lucky German shot while repositioning, and had 2 more damaged but operational. But the battle wasn't over. "Actual to all units," Evans radioed. "German second wave approaching from the northeast. Estimate 20-plus vehicles, including tank destroyers, reposition to defensive line Charlie and prepare for sustained engagement." This was the doctrine in its purest form. The Hellcats weren't staying to defend the ambush site. That would mean accepting a static fight against superior numbers. Instead, they used their speed to disengage, falling back to new positions where they could repeat the ambush tactics against the next German formation. The next 3 days became a masterclass in mobile defense. The Hellcats raced between position and position, using Lorraine's rolling terrain to create kill zones where their speed and flanking tactics could negate German armor advantages. The Panthers and Tiger Desailles that came against them were magnificent machines, better armored, more powerfully gunned, mechanically sophisticated, but they were slow. And in the mathematics of armored warfare, slow meant dead. Sergeant Hartmann's Hellcat became legendary during those 72 hours. On the second day, his crew engaged 6 Panthers in a running fight that lasted 40 minutes. The German tanks tried to corner them against a tree line, using their superior armor to close to point-blank range where even the Hellcat's flanking shots would be useless, but Hartmann kept moving. He'd learned the vehicle's capabilities at the Milford Proving Ground, understood exactly what the torsion bar suspension and Continental engine could deliver. He drove the Hellcat like a sports car, using terrain features for cover, emerging only long enough to fire, then vanishing before German return fire could acquire him. 6 Panthers destroyed, 0 Hellcats lost. When the Battle of Arracourt finally ended on September 22nd, the arithmetic was brutal and undeniable. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion had accounted for 39 German tanks confirmed destroyed. The entire engagement, involving multiple American divisions and German Panzer units, saw nearly 200 German armored vehicles eliminated. The Hellcat had proven itself not through technological superiority, but through doctrinal correctness. Every decision Bruce had made, prioritizing speed, accepting minimal armor, emphasizing flanking tactics, had been validated in the crucible of combat. Every engineering choice Earl's team had made, the suspension, the power-to-weight ratio, the gun mounting, had translated directly into tactical advantage. But standing in the aftermath, watching recovery crews tow damaged vehicles and medics tend to wounded crews, Leiper understood something that the statistics didn't capture. The victory wasn't inevitable. It required crews who understood their vehicles' capabilities and limitations, who could exploit speed and positioning, who had the training and courage to fight outnumbered against technically superior opponents. The Hellcat was magnificent, but it was magnificent only in the hands of crews who fought the way Bruce had envisioned. Aggressive in reconnaissance, patient in ambush, ruthless in exploitation. "We finally did it," Hartman said, approaching with a canteen and exhaustion written on his face. "The doctrine worked." "Parts of it," Leiper replied. He was thinking of Anzio, of the hedgerows, of all the missions where the Hellcat had succeeded by ignoring its intended role. "We're learning that doctrine is a starting point, not a destination." That evening, as Company C bivouacked in a liberated French village, Captain Evans assembled the crews for a debriefing. Maps showed the engagement geometry, casualty reports detailed the cost, and intelligence summaries analyzed German tactical responses. "This is what we were built for," Evans said, tapping the map where their ambush positions had been marked. "Everything we've learned, Italy, Normandy, the hedgerows, was preparation for this moment, but it only worked because we adapted. The Germans didn't do what we expected. The fog changed the engagement parameters. The terrain forced us to modify our positions. So the doctrine works, but only if we don't follow it exactly," then the platoon leader asked. Evans smiled grimly. "The doctrine works because it gives us a foundation. Speed, mobility, flanking tactics, those principles are sound. But combat always finds the gaps in any plan. The Hellcat succeeds because it's adaptable enough to exploit opportunities the doctrine never anticipated." Leiper thought about the Panther that had almost killed them, about the split-second decision to reverse at full speed, about Hartman's instinctive understanding of the vehicle's capabilities. The victory at Arracourt wasn't about following a manual. It was about crews who understood their weapons so completely they could improvise solutions in real time. The fog had been perfect, but it was the velocity, mechanical and mental, that had won the battle. Bastogne, Belgium, December 19th, 1944. The snow began falling at 0400 hours, fat flakes that turned the Ardennes forest into a monochrome photograph. Lieutenant Edwin Leiper watched it accumulate on the Hellcat's gun barrel, thinking about how completely wrong this entire situation was. 3 months after Arracourt's perfect validation of Bruce's doctrine, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion found itself doing everything the doctrine explicitly prohibited. They weren't mobile. They weren't concentrated. They weren't choosing their engagement geometry. They were surrounded. Bastogne sat in a shallow valley where 7 roads converged, a critical junction that the German offensive needed to capture if their breakthrough was going to reach the Meuse River. The 101st Airborne held the town itself, dug into hasty defensive positions after being trucked in ahead of the German advance, and scattered around the perimeter wherever the line looked weakest were the tank destroyers. 4 Hellcats from the 705th's Company B were positioned on the northern approach, hulled down in fighting positions that infantry had scraped from the frozen ground. No room for the speed tactics that had won at Arracourt. No ability to use mobility to control engagement range. Just static defense. The exact scenario Colonel Bruce had designed the tank destroyer force to avoid. Movement 12 o'clock. Sergeant Hartman called from his position as gunner. Range 800 meters. Looks like infantry in the tree line. Leiper raised his binoculars, scanning the forest edge. The German attack had been developing for 2 days now, probing actions designed to find weak points in the American perimeter. Yesterday, they'd sent infantry against the southern sector. Today, apparently, they were testing the north. But it wasn't just infantry. Through the falling snow, Leiper could see the unmistakable silhouette of German armor. Panzer III's, recognizable by their shorter guns and boxy turrets, moving in support of the infantry advance. Behind them, partially obscured by trees, something larger. A tiger? A panther? At this distance, in these conditions, identification was impossible. "Gunner, load AP," Leiper ordered, "but hold fire. Let them come closer." This violated every instinct the Arracourt battle had drilled into them. There, they'd use mobility to dictate range and angle, striking from flanking positions before the enemy could respond. Here, mobility was irrelevant. The Hellcat was anchored to this position by mission and terrain, forced to fight frontally, the one engagement geometry it was explicitly designed to avoid. The German armor advanced cautiously, using the tree line for cover, infantry moving ahead to screen for American anti-tank weapons. Standard combined arms tactics, executed with the methodical professionalism of Wehrmacht veterans. They'd done this 1,000 times on the Eastern Front. At 600 meters, Leiper could identify the lead vehicle clearly, a Panzer rear fur ASF. H, frontal armor 80 millimeters thick. The Hellcat's 76 millimeter gun could penetrate that, but not reliably. Not at this angle. The math that had worked so perfectly at Arracourt, flanking shots against vulnerable side armor, was now inverted. They'd have to shoot through the strongest part of the German tank with a gun that was marginal for the task. 500 meters, Hartmann reported. "I have a firing solution on the lead Panzer." "Hold," Leiper said, watching the German formation. They were advancing in a wedge, the lead tank slightly ahead of the others, drawing fire. Classic tactics. The point vehicle was bait designed to make defenders reveal their positions. The moment the Hellcat fired, every German gun would know exactly where they were. 400 meters. The Panzer IV was close enough now that Leiper could see the commander standing in the cupola, scanning the American line through binoculars, looking for the trap they knew was there. Behind the lead tank, 3 more Panzers advanced, and behind them, emerging fully from the tree line, the vehicle Leiper had feared. A Panther, its long gun unmistakable even in the snow. 50 tons of German engineering, frontal armor over 100 millimeters thick, sloped at angles that made penetration nearly impossible. The Hellcat, designed to avoid exactly this fight, was about to take it anyway. "Fire," Leiper ordered. The 76 millimeter gun cracked, the sound flat in the heavy air. The armor-piercing round crossed 400 meters in a second, striking the Panzer IV's glacis plate at the driver's position. The angle was poor. The German tank's armor was tilted away from them, but the kinetic energy was sufficient. The shell punched through, and the Panzer Warf lurched to a halt, smoke beginning to pour from its hatches. "Target destroyed," Hartmann confirmed, already traversing to the next tank. "Engaging Panzer at 11 o'clock, but now the Germans knew where they were. The second Panzer IV's gun flashed, and a 75 millimeter shell screamed over the Hellcat's position, missing by meters. Return fire from a hull-down position, the German gunner aiming at the flash of their muzzle. "Gunner, same target, fire when ready," Leiper said, forcing calm into his voice. The engagement devolved into a brutal exchange of fire at ranges where both sides could hurt each other. The Hellcat's rate of fire was higher. The open turret and efficient crew positions meant they could reload and fire faster than the buttoned-up German crews, but the Germans had numbers and heavier armor. The second Panzer IV died. Then the Panther opened fire. The 90 millimeter shell from the Panther's KWK-42 gun hit the ground 5 meters in front of the Hellcat's position, spraying frozen earth and shrapnel. The German gunner was ranging, walking his fire toward the American position with methodical precision. The next shot would be dead on. "Can we penetrate him?" Leiper asked, knowing the answer. "Not frontally," Hartmann replied. "Not at this range, not with standard AP rounds." They were facing the exact scenario the Hellcat was designed to avoid, a frontal engagement against superior armor with inadequate firepower. Everything about the vehicle, its speed, its minimal armor, its flanking tactics, was useless in this static defensive fight. And yet, they had to fight it anyway. "Switch to HE," Leiper ordered. "Aim for his tracks. We can't kill him, but maybe we can immobilize him." It was improvisation born of desperation. The high explosive round wasn't designed for armor penetration. It was the anti-infantry ammunition they'd used so extensively at Anzio. But against the Panthers' tracks and running gear, it might do enough damage to stop the advance. Hartman fired. The HE round impacted the Panthers' left track at the drive sprocket, detonating in a flash of fragmentation. The track separated, flying off in a tangle of steel links. The Panther slewed to one side, its crew fighting to control the suddenly immobile vehicle. "Target immobilized," Hartman reported, reloading AP. The disabled Panther couldn't advance, but it could still fire. Its turret traversed smoothly, the electric motor unaffected by the track damage, bringing the long gun to bear on the Hellcat's position. At 400 meters, the Panther's gun could punch through any part of the Hellcat's armor with contemptuous ease. "Driver, reverse now," Leiper ordered. The Hellcat shot backward out of its fighting position, the Continental engine screaming. They'd rehearsed this at the Milford Proving Ground, emergency displacement when a position was compromised. The speed that couldn't be used for flanking maneuvers could still save them from incoming fire. The Panther's shot hit where they'd been, blasting the frozen earth into a crater, close enough that Leiper felt the pressure wave through the hull. "Secondary position 100 meters north," he directed the driver. "Get us hull down and traverse to engage the infantry." Because while the armored duel was happening, German infantry had continued their advance. They were within 300 meters now, using the distraction of the tank fight to close on the American line. If they reached the perimeter, they'd overrun the thinly held positions with sheer numbers. The Hellcat slid into its alternate position, a slight rise that gave cover from the immobilized Panther while allowing fire against the infantry. Hartman switched to HE and began systematically shelling the German advance, each round creating casualties and forcing the infantry to seek cover. This wasn't tank destroyer doctrine. This was combined arms defense, using whatever weapons were available to hold a critical position. The Hellcat wasn't hunting armor. It was being the mobile fire support that infantry needed when they were outnumbered and surrounded. The battle continued for 3 hours. The German attack broke against the northern perimeter in waves, each one getting closer before being thrown back by American fire. The Hellcats shifted between positions, using their mobility to respond to threats across a 2-kilometer front, filling gaps wherever the line weakened. By noon, when the German forces finally withdrew, the 705th Company B had fired 287 rounds of ammunition, 201 high explosive, 86 armor-piercing. They destroyed 2 Panzerfrees, immobilized 1 Panther, and broken up at least 4 infantry assaults. 3 Hellcats were damaged, one badly enough that it needed to be towed to the rear for repairs. Captain Evans found Leiper that afternoon trudging through the snow to the Hellcat's position. The vehicle sat with its engine running, generating heat for the crew, smoke rising into the gray sky. "Division wants our after-action report," Evans said without preamble. "They're trying to understand how we're holding against forces that should have overrun us 2 days ago." Leiper gestured at the Hellcat. "We're using it wrong, sir. Everything about this situation violates doctrine. We're static when we should be mobile. We're defending when we should be attacking. We're engaging frontally when we should be flanking. And yet we're winning." "Yes, sir." Evans was silent for a moment, studying the vehicle. "Colonel Bruce designed the Hellcat for a specific type of warfare, mobile defense against breakthrough armor. But warfare doesn't care about our designs. We adapt or we die." "At Arracourt, the doctrine was perfect," Leiper said. "Open terrain, massed armor, exactly the scenario Bruce envisioned. Here, nothing works the way it's supposed to, but the Hellcat is still effective because it's a well-designed weapon system," Evans finished. "The speed lets us respond to threats across a wide front. The gun is adequate for most targets we encounter. The open turret gives us situational awareness that buttoned-up crews don't have. The vehicle works even when we're using it for purposes it was never intended for." Over the next week, as the German offensive ground itself to pieces against Bastonia's perimeter, the pattern repeated. The Hellcats were everywhere, providing mobile artillery support here, engaging armor there, covering withdrawals when positions became untenable. They operated individually or in pairs, never in the massed formations Bruce's doctrine required, always improvising responses to immediate tactical crises. On December 26th, when Patton's Third Army broke through to relieve Bastogne, the 705th's vehicles were dispersed across the entire perimeter, embedded with infantry units, functioning as general-purpose fire support. A visiting staff officer from Tank Destroyer Command was appalled. "This isn't how tank destroyers are supposed to be employed," he told Evans. "You've completely abandoned the doctrine." "The doctrine," Evans replied outside, "assumes the enemy cooperates with our plans. When they don't, we cooperate with reality instead." The officer left unsatisfied, taking notes for a report that would question whether the tank destroyer concept remained viable. But the crews who'd fought at Bastogne understood something the staff officers didn't. The Hellcat succeeded not because it perfectly embodied a doctrine, but because it was adaptable enough to transcend it. On Christmas Eve, with the fighting temporarily paused, Leiper stood beside his Hellcat, watching snow fall on the Ardennes forest. Hartman joined him, sharing a cigarette that tasted like cold and exhaustion. "Arracourt was what we were built for," Hartman said quietly. "This is what we're good at." Leiper understood the distinction. At Arracourt, the Hellcat had validated Bruce's vision, speed, and mobility, defeating heavier armor through superior tactics. At Bastogne, the Hellcat had validated something more fundamental. Good engineering creates tools that work even when used in ways the engineers never imagined. The paradox was complete. The Hellcat achieved its greatest success by abandoning the doctrine that created it, proving that sometimes the best weapon is the one flexible enough to fight wars that don't follow the plan. The snow continued falling, covering the frozen battlefield in white silence, and the Hellcat waited for whatever mission came next. Fort Knox, Kentucky, November 1945. The war had been over for 6 months when Colonel Andrew Bruce stood in a warehouse filled with M18 Hellcats awaiting disposition. Row after row of them painted in the camouflage schemes of different theaters. European olive drab, Pacific green, the hastily applied whitewash from the Battle of the Bulge still visible on some hulls. Engines silent, guns elevated to travel position. They looked almost peaceful. The final statistics had been compiled, analyzed, and submitted to the War Department. The numbers told a story that Bruce found simultaneously validating and disturbing. 526 enemy vehicles destroyed. Confirmed kills 498 in Europe, 17 in Italy, 11 in the Pacific Theater. Kill-to-loss ratio of 2.4 to 1, the highest of any American tank or tank destroyer deployed during the war. By every measurable metric, the M18 Hellcat was the most effective tank destroyer the United States had fielded. But there was a second set of numbers buried deeper in the operational reports. Of all combat actions involving M18 battalions, approximately 80% were classified as secondary missions: infantry support, bunker reduction, anti-artillery fire, convoy escort, direct engagement with enemy armor. The primary mission Bruce had envisioned represented only a fifth of the Hellcat's actual combat employment. The doctrine and the reality had diverged so completely that they barely recognized each other. Lieutenant Edwin Leiper, recently promoted to captain and assigned to Fort Knox as an instructor, found Bruce studying a particular Hellcat. The vehicle bore the markings of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, the unit that had tested the first prototypes at the Milford Proving Ground in 1943. Serial number 41007, Bruce said, reading the identification plate. This one fought at Arracourt. And Bastogne, Leiper added, and the Rhine crossing, and about a dozen smaller engagements in between. She went through 3 different crews and 4 engine replacements. Walked around the vehicle slowly, his hand trailing along the hull. The armor showed scars, welding repairs where German shells had struck without penetrating, patches where the thin plate had been compromised and reinforced. The open turret was dented from shrapnel, and someone had painted a Wildcat insignia on the glacis plate above the original factory logo. "I designed the doctrine in 1941, Bruce said quietly. Mobile defense, massed formations responding to armor breakthroughs. Seek, strike, destroy. I was so certain I understood what future warfare would look like. The doctrine worked at Arracourt, sir, perfectly. Once, it worked perfectly once. Bruce's voice carried no bitterness, only a kind of exhausted reflection. Every other engagement, the crews had to improvise. Anzio, the hedgerows, Bastogne. The Hellcat succeeded by ignoring what I told them to do. They stood in silence, surrounded by the evidence of a doctrine that had been simultaneously validated and rendered obsolete. The war had proven that Bruce's fundamental insight, that speed could substitute for armor, was correct. But it had also proven that no doctrine survives contact with reality unchanged. The tank destroyer force is being disbanded, Bruce continued. The Army has concluded that separate anti-tank formations are unnecessary. Future armor doctrine will integrate tank-killing capabilities into standard armored and mechanized divisions. Leiper had heard the rumors. The institutional battles were already underway, the armored branch arguing that they'd been right all along. The tank destroyers were redundant with proper tank design, the artillery branch claiming that towed anti-tank guns were more cost-effective than self-propelled vehicles. The infantry branch wanting the mobile fire support that vehicles like the Hellcat provided, but under their organizational control. What happens to the Hellcats? Leiper asked. Most will be scrapped. Some will go to allied nations through military aid programs. A few dozen will be retained for training purposes. Bruce paused. I've been asked to write the final assessment, lessons learned, recommendations for future procurement. What should I tell them, Captain? That we built the right weapon for the wrong war? Or that we built a weapon so adaptable it succeeded despite our doctrine? Before Leiper could answer, Sergeant Henry Hartman appeared in the warehouse entrance, accompanied by a civilian in a well-tailored suit. Leiper recognized him immediately. Robert Lauer, the Buick engineer who translated Harley Earl's designs into functional combat vehicles. Colonel Bruce, Lauer said, extending his hand. I heard you were here. I wanted to see them one more time before they're disposed of. Bruce shook his hand. Your engineering succeeded, Mr. Lauer. The vehicles performed beyond specifications. But not in the way we designed them to, Lauer replied, walking to the nearest Hellcat. He ran his hand over the torsion bar suspension assembly, visible through the track spacing. We built this system to provide stability at high speeds, smooth ride during flanking maneuvers, rapid position changes, automotive engineering applied to military requirements. And it worked, Hartman interjected. At Arracourt, we drove like we were in a goddamn sports car. The Panthers couldn't keep up. But that was one battle, Lauer said. The reports I've read suggest that most of the time you were using the Hellcat as mobile artillery, direct fire support against bunkers and infantry positions. That's not what the suspension was optimized for. No, Leiper agreed. But it turned out the same suspension that provided stability at 60 miles per hour also provided stability when firing from uneven ground. The independent wheel movement meant we could shoot accurately from positions where other vehicles would have been bouncing. We used it differently than intended, but the engineering was sound enough that it worked anyway. Lauer nodded slowly, understanding something that went beyond the immediate conversation. That's the difference between good engineering and perfect engineering. Perfect engineering optimizes for a specific use case and fails when circumstances change. Good engineering creates systems robust enough to handle applications the designer never imagined. Is that what we built? Bruce asked. Good engineering rather than perfect doctrine? You built both, sir, Leiper said. The doctrine worked when conditions allowed. At Arracourt, everything aligned. Open terrain, massed armor, weather that favored close engagement, but the engineering worked everywhere. Anzio, Bastogne, the Philippines. The crews survived and succeeded because the vehicle was fundamentally well designed. Bruce walked to the warehouse's large doors, looking out across Fort Knox's training grounds. In the distance, new M26 Pershing tanks were conducting exercises. Heavy armor with 90mm guns, the Army's answer to German Tigers and Panthers. They were slower than Hellcats, more heavily armored, designed for the frontal engagements that Bruce's doctrine had tried to avoid. The future of armored warfare, Bruce said, gesturing toward the Pershings. Heavier guns, thicker armor, more powerful engines to push the additional weight. We're going back to the assumption that armor saves lives. Does it? Hartman asked. No, sometimes, but so does speed, so does good tactics, so does crew training. Bruce turned back to the warehouse. The Hellcat taught us that there's no single answer to armored warfare. Different situations demand different solutions. Over the following months, as the M18 Hellcats were systematically removed from American service, something unexpected happened. The vehicles found new lives in foreign militaries where resources were limited and versatility was valued. Yugoslavia, Greece, Italy, Pakistan, the Republic of China, nations that couldn't afford fleets of heavy tanks welcomed the Hellcat's combination of speed, firepower, and mechanical reliability. The torsion bar suspension, Buick's automotive innovation applied to military vehicles, became standard on successive generations of American armor. The M24 Chaffee light tank used it. The M41 Walker Bulldog used it. Eventually, even the M1 Abrams, America's main battle tank decades later, would employ torsion bar suspension derived from the principles Lauer's team had developed in 1943. The engineering outlived the doctrine by generations. In 1952, when Leiper returned to Fort Knox as a senior instructor in armored warfare, he used the Hellcat as a case study for officer candidates, not as an example of perfect doctrine, but as an illustration of how doctrine and reality interact in combat. The M18 was designed for a specific type of warfare, he would tell classes of young officers. Mobile defense against massed armor breakthroughs, and when that warfare materialized at Arracourt, the vehicle performed exactly as intended, but that perfect alignment of doctrine and reality represented less than 5% of the Hellcat's combat employment. So the doctrine was wrong, a student would inevitably ask. The doctrine was incomplete, Leiper would correct. Colonel Bruce understood something fundamental, that speed provides tactical options armor cannot. But he couldn't predict every scenario where that speed would be valuable. The crews discovered applications he never imagined. Rapid response to threatened sectors, mobile fire support for infantry, quick exploitation of tactical opportunities. He would show them the statistics. 5 and 26 confirmed kills, 80% in secondary missions, kill ratio of 2.4 to 1. Then he'd show them the survival rates. Hellcat crews had higher survival rates than Sherman tank crews despite having 1/6 the armor protection. Speed was armor, he'd conclude, not because it prevented hits, but because it allowed crews to control engagement parameters. They chose when to fight, where to fight, and when to disengage. That choice, that tactical flexibility, saved more lives than steel plate could have. The lesson went deeper than the Hellcat. It was about the relationship between technology and doctrine, between engineering and tactics, between planning and improvisation. The American military was learning, slowly and painfully, that the next war would never perfectly resemble the last one. Weapon systems needed to be adaptable. Crews needed to be trained to think rather than just follow procedures. And doctrine needed to be flexible enough to evolve with battlefield realities. In 1995, a restored M18 Hellcat was displayed at the Patton Museum at Fort Knox. The placard beside it read, M18 Hellcat Gun Motor Carriage, fastest tank destroyer of World War II. Top speed 55 lp/h. Kill ratio 2.4/1. The statistics were accurate but incomplete. They didn't capture the innovation of automotive designers solving military problems, the courage of crews racing into fog to ambush Panthers, the adaptability that allowed a specialized weapon to succeed across a spectrum of missions its designers never anticipated. They didn't capture the fundamental lesson that sometimes the most perfect doctrine is the willingness to abandon doctrine when reality demands it. Colonel Andrew Bruce died in 1969, long after the tank destroyer force had been dissolved and forgotten by most of the Army. But the principles he'd championed, mobility, aggressiveness, the understanding that speed could be a defensive weapon, remained embedded in American armored doctrine. The Hellcat's legacy wasn't the kill ratio or the speed records. It was the proof that good engineering could transcend the limitations of the doctrine that created it. That adaptability was more valuable than optimization, and that sometimes the best weapon is the one versatile enough to fight wars that don't follow the plan. The torsion bars that Buick engineers developed for a luxury ride became the foundation of military suspension systems for 3 generations of armored vehicles. The open turret that worried safety officers provided situational awareness that saved countless lives. The minimal armor that should have been a fatal flaw became acceptable when paired with speed that let crews dictate engagement terms. In the warehouse at Fort Knox that November day in 1945, surrounded by Hellcats awaiting disposal, Bruce had asked what lesson they should take forward. The answer was written in the scarred hulls of vehicles that had survived impossible odds, in the innovation of crews who'd found new uses for specialized tools, in the engineering excellence that made adaptation possible. The lesson was this: build weapons well enough that they work even when the war changes. Train crews well enough that they can improvise when doctrine fails. And understand that the gap between planning and reality is where wars are actually won. The M18 Hellcat, called tin cans by German tankers who learned to fear them anyway, had proven all of that. Its guns were silent now, its engines cold, its combat days finished, but the principles it embodied would echo through decades of armored warfare. A reminder that sometimes the most revolutionary weapon is the one that refuses to be limited by the revolution that created it. The fastest tank destroyer of World War II had taught the slowest lesson: that adaptability beats optimization, that engineering can outlive doctrine, and that the human capacity for innovation under pressure remains the most powerful weapon system ever designed.